On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of Americans gathered around television screens to watch a space shuttle launch. But this one was different. Across the country, TVs were rolled into school hallways, teachers paused lessons, and students sat cross-legged on cold tile floors. For the first time in history, one of their own, a teacher, was going into space. 73 seconds after liftoff, however, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart in midair. At first, there was no reaction, because no one understood what they were seeing. There was no explosion sound on the broadcast, only confusion. Two white trails arced outward across a blue Florida sky as NASA's voice looped on live television.
Obviously a major malfunction.
It would take hours for the country to accept what had happened, and years to understand why it happened. This is the story of the Challenger disaster. Not just of a shuttle that was lost, but of a system that failed long before launch day. By the mid-1980s, the space shuttle was no longer seen as experimental. NASA had sold it as a reusable space truck, a vehicle that would make access to space routine, affordable, and reliable. Politicians believed it, the public believed it, and after more than 20 successful missions, NASA itself began to believe it too. Launches were no longer rare national events. They were scheduled months in advance, sometimes back-to-back, and delays were seen as logistical inconveniences and not red flags. NASA's internal culture reflected this confidence. Risk was acknowledged, but increasingly normalized. Problems that hadn't yet caused a catastrophe were quietly reclassified as acceptable. And nowhere was that more evident than in the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Each shuttle launch relied on two massive solid rocket boosters attached to the external fuel tank. These boosters were assembled in segments and joined together with rubber seals called O-rings. The O-ring's job was simple but vital: prevent superheated gases from escaping during ignition. But engineers had known for years that the O-rings had a problem. In colder temperatures, the rubber became stiff, and they didn't seal as quickly. Hot gas could leak through, a phenomenon called blow-by. This wasn't hypothetical. It had already happened on previous missions. Instead of grounding the shuttle program, NASA documented the issue, adjusted acceptable risk levels, and continued flying. Each successful launch reinforced the idea that the problem was manageable. Until Challenger. Challenger's final mission, STS-51L, was already behind schedule due to weather delays, technical delays, and political delays. The launch was under intense pressure, driven in part by Christa McAuliffe's presence. McAuliffe was a high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from over 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space program. She was meant to inspire a generation, broadcasting lessons from orbit. President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to mention her mission in his upcoming State of the Union address. The launch mattered, symbolically, politically, and culturally. And then Florida experienced an unusual cold snap. Overnight temperatures at Cape Canaveral dropped into the mid to low 20s Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous shuttle launch. On the evening of January 27th, engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, held an emergency teleconference with NASA officials. Their message was clear: do not launch. They presented data showing that O-ring performance degraded in cold temperatures and explained that the upcoming launch would occur in conditions colder than any previously tested. Several engineers explicitly warned that the seals might fail, but NASA pushed back. They questioned the data and asked for proof that the shuttle would fail rather than evidence that it might. They framed delay as an overreaction. At one point, a NASA manager reportedly asked, "When do you want me to launch? Next April?" Under pressure, Morton Thiokol management overruled their own engineers. They reversed their recommendation, and the launch was approved. One engineer later recalled sitting in silence, knowing exactly what might happen, and being powerless to stop it. January 28, 1986, launch day. The rocket platform was coated in ice, with icicles hanging from the structure. Engineers raised concerns again, but no formal objections were filed. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Challenger lifted off. But less than 1 second after liftoff, a puff of black smoke appeared near the right solid rocket booster, exactly where the O-rings were located. The seal had failed. Hot gases began escaping, eating through the booster joint. At 58 seconds into flight, Challenger encountered strong wind shear. The already weakened joint ruptured completely. At 73 seconds, a jet of flame pierced the external fuel tank and it failed catastrophically. The shuttle then disintegrated. On live television, confusion reigned. NASA did not immediately declare the crew lost. Early statements suggested the orbiter had broken apart, but avoided confirming fatalities. In reality, the crew cabin remained largely intact after the breakup. Investigators later concluded that the astronauts were likely alive for at least part of the descent, with the cabin striking the Atlantic Ocean at over 200 miles per hour. In the end, there were no survivors. Francis Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe were all lost in front of millions. That evening, President Reagan addressed the country. He postponed the State of the Union and spoke directly to the American people, especially to the children who had watched the launch from their classrooms. He said,
as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
The words were comforting, but they didn't answer the question, how could this happen? President Reagan formed an independent investigative panel called the Rogers Commission. It included astronauts, military leaders, scientists, and physicist Richard Feynman. As the investigation unfolded, a troubling picture emerged. NASA had known about the O-ring problem for years. Launch decisions were being driven by schedule pressures and not safety margins. Warnings from engineers were being filtered, softened, or ignored as they moved up the management chain. Feynman famously demonstrated the O-ring issue during a televised hearing, dropping a piece of rubber into ice water and showing how it lost elasticity. His conclusion was blunt. For a successful technology, reality must take precedent over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. The Challenger disaster was not caused by cold weather alone. It was caused by organizational failure, a culture where concerns were normalized instead of addressed, where dissent was seen as obstruction, where success bred complacency. The shuttle didn't fail suddenly, it failed gradually, over years of small compromises. The Space Shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. NASA redesigned the solid rocket boosters, safety oversight was restructured, and communication protocols were changed. But Challenger permanently altered how Americans view spaceflight. The illusion of routine was shattered, and yet space exploration continued. Despite the devastating loss of Challenger and its crew, no one faced criminal prosecution. Investigations focused on organizational and technical failures rather than individual criminal liability. The Rogers Commission and subsequent reviews identified serious lapses at both NASA and Morton Thiokol, including ignored warnings and poor communication. But these were treated as professional and civil matters. Accountability came in the form of resignations, policy changes, and restructuring within NASA and its contractors rather than legal penalties. The Challenger disasters taught in engineering schools, business ethics courses, and leadership programs, not because of what broke, but because of why warnings were ignored. It's a case study in what happens when systems stop listening to the people closest to the danger. And it's a reminder that progress, no matter how inspiring, demands humility. On January 28, 1986, America lost 7 astronauts. But it also lost an illusion, the belief that technology alone could outrun human error. The Challenger disaster reminds us that the greatest failures often begin long before a rocket ever leaves the ground. They happen in meetings, in decisions made when no one wants to say no. And the unfortunate truth is that the cost of silence is often measured in human lives, both on Earth and in space. Thank you everybody for watching. I make new videos every week, so if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd appreciate the support.